Hello guys, welcome to my new video, and today we'll be raiding all of the dungeons from the last 3 expansions, and mainly this was prompted by the fact that Legion Mythic Plus is coming back in 9.15, and I kind of want to see, in terms of my personal opinion, how all of these expansion dungeons compare to each other in terms of my enjoyment. So before we're gonna start the video, big disclaimer. When I was thinking about how to rank the best or favorite dungeons, there's a lot of different ways you can decide if a dungeon is good or bad. Maybe you look at the design, maybe it's linear like King's Rest, maybe it's open area like Halls of Atonement or Junkyard, maybe it has a gimmick mechanic to it like Court of Stars or possibly Warcraft Manor where you have the doors opening. How do you rank those? And honestly, I thought about this and there's no good way of ranking this outside of my personal opinion. My favorite dungeon. So if I was given all of these dungeon keys at this given point right now, which dungeons would I like to run first? You'll notice that a lot of times how easy a dungeon is will correlate to players' enjoyment. So it is something that's gonna make or shape this list or ranking, so keep that in mind, but it is my subjective opinion. And again, I love to hear your opinions on your favorite dungeons. Let me know in the comments. So let's go and get started. So first of all, the other side, and this is a Shadowlands dungeon. Okay, I have thought about this and I'm probably gonna put it in F tier. The reason I'm gonna do this is because I don't hate the other side bosses or trash, but I hate the fact that there's so much downtime. You spend so much time traveling from one place. The fact that a dungeon has 30, 40 plus minute timers, it is too long in my opinion. I think dungeons should be around 30 minutes max. I think that creates the most enjoyable experience with pugs and things like that. So too much downtime between areas and it's just too long. I almost feel they should have kind of cut out an area or maybe make it into 2 dungeons instead of 1. And that's how I feel about the other side. Halls of Atonement is actually one of my favorite Shadowlands dungeons, and I'm probably either gonna put it in A or B tier, I'm not sure. I think I'm gonna go with A tier. The reason I like Halls is because you'll notice that throughout the whole dungeon design is that a lot of the Shadowlands dungeons start off open and you can pick which side you want to do, and then it goes into a linear kind of pattern, which is okay. I wish it was more kind of, you know, open to some extent, but I like Halls of Atonement. I think the bosses are fun. I think the trash are fun. I think it's one of those dungeons that I like doing. Again, it is not an overly difficult dungeon, but it does require certain, how do I say it? A good path can make a lot of difference in this because of how open it is at the start. Mr. Genocide is something that I actually like as well, but B or C, I'm not 100% sure in this case. I think I'm going to put it into B at this given point, but I might change it throughout the listing. You have to notice Mist has a gimmick mechanic to it where you have to kind of, you know, you have to use the flowers and you have to pick the right door. Now, this gimmick has been almost simplified by the fact that you have a lot of weak auras out there that help you with this, and it almost becomes... Let me know in the chat, do you find the flower mechanic interesting or something kind of stupid because weak auras have kind of made it relevant? I still think Mist is a fun dungeon. I like the first boss because he has a, you know, take extra damage, so you have to save your cooldowns, you have to play it. I like majority of the bosses in there. I don't think it's a bad dungeon. I don't think it's an amazing dungeon, but I'll do it any day of the week. It's one of the dungeons that I do a lot of times. Now, Plaguefall. A lot of people hate Plaguefall. A lot of people hate Plaguefall. I don't hate Plaguefall. I think it's somewhere in the mid tier. I really think that Plaguefall could be better, but at the same time, I don't think it is a bad dungeon. The fact that you can do a lot of these gimmicky mechanics with the plague boars and things like that was an issue at the start, but they nerfed it, so it's a little bit less confusing. I don't hate it and I don't love it. I think it's somewhere in the C tier of pain. I don't like. Now, this is either going to be F tier or D tier. I'm not 100% sure. I think I'm going to put it in D tier. The fact that a lot of the bosses in my eyes don't feel that engaging or they don't feel that fun. A lot of the trash bags don't feel all that great fun. I don't know exactly why I don't like Theater of Pain, but I really just don't like doing it. And let me know if you feel in a similar way, but if I had Theater of Pain key, the only reason I would do it is because it drops that juicy soul-letting ruby, and that's about it. Necrotic Wake is a dungeon that is extremely easy. Probably one of the easiest dungeons right now in Shadowlands, and a lot of people love running it because it is very linear to some extent, because the second part of Necrotic Wake is basically you have to stand in one area and just mobs come at you. There is a lot of gimmicky mechanics with, you know, the the arrows and the cleaves, and you can use that to take down NPC mobs. I really enjoy Necrotic Wake, and it's on par to Halls of Atonement. I might actually enjoy Necrotic Wake more, because even if it is so simple, I like damage boosting abilities that you get from Kyrian, and all of a sudden your numbers are inflated. It is probably not a really clever design to a dungeon, but for some reason I love running it. And again, it's a subjective list that I enjoy doing it. It is easy, Halls of Atonement is easy, but I still really like these dungeons. Spires is an F tier for me. Now, a lot of people are going to disagree with this. I hate Spires, and there's a reason why I hate Spires. First of all, I don't like the downtime between the platforms, but the last trash pack has ruined it for me. You know, the 3 mobs that you need to pull, that they do this like little black clouds coming, and then there is a frontal attack that they changed. The fact that you have this mechanic, especially on Fortify, that makes it really intense, but you also have these angels behind you that obstruct your view, and those angels have been fixed. It was way worse at the start of Shadowlands. That trash pack, with the fact that you're visually impaired because of everything else going on, makes that dungeon the most hated dungeon I've ever seen. Maybe not the most, but it destroyed my whole dungeon experience because of that last part. I feel if they removed those 3 trash pack mobs, they removed the area or cleaned it up a little bit, it would be so much nicer. And again, I feel a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this, but the last part was really awkward. Sanguine Deaths. Now, a lot of people are going to hate this. I actually would put Sanguine in a B tier, right below Mist. The reason I put Sanguine, the reason a lot of people hate Sanguine is because it was so difficult at the very start. It was so difficult. The trash mobs, the bosses are still extremely difficult. But it is not a bad experience, in my opinion. I like the vibe of the dungeon. I like the fact that if you have Event here, you have these damage boosting abilities that are going to increase your damage based on how many mobs you killed and things like that. Maybe I should move it a little bit lower. Maybe I should move it here to C tier, high C tier. Because if you have affixes that create ground effects like Sanguine and things like that, this becomes an issue because of the narrow platforms or the narrow dungeon areas that you have. So I think this dungeon suffers a lot from affixes, but if it didn't, I probably would put it as a B tier or something along those lines. Ataldazar, this is an easy S tier. Ataldazar is one of my favorite dungeons. It has a really open view. The whole dungeon is extremely open in terms of, do you want to go left, do you want to go right? And with certain affixes, they became even more interesting. I like the bosses in it. There was a lot of interesting mechanic to bosses as well. Like, you know, the Rexar, the Raptor, it chooses a certain person to chase. You can cheese it. If I was allowed to do this key again, I would probably do it over and over again, because it made my day to some extent. Freehold is another dungeon that's going to be S tier for me. Freehold is, I prefer Freehold over Ataldazar. I'll take Freehold any day of the week. For some reason, this dungeon was perfection. I honestly think I'm honestly not sure if Blizzard could ever improve upon Freehold. It just gave me, like, I always enjoyed doing it. The bosses were really fun. The bosses were not overly difficult, but they had these clever mechanics as well. The trash were not bad. The overview, the atmosphere was pretty cool. I'll do Freehold and Ataldazar any day of the week. King's Rest, another F tier dungeon, extremely linear. Bosses were somewhat difficult, but they were not, for me at least, they were not that fun, especially the second last boss, which basically meant that if a person gets this debuff, you have to constantly heal them. And some classes, especially healing classes, this is coming from a healer perspective, if you didn't have like a movement ability that you can heal on the move, the person would die because it requires so much healing. Or if you didn't have specific like immunities, this would become really troublesome at high keys. So and again, you have to remember, the last trash mob before the last boss was probably harder than most bosses combined for like a year or 2 years before it got nerfed. And even after it got nerfed, it was still really hard. So there were some really big issues with King's Rest, in my opinion. I do not enjoy doing this at all. Operation Mechagon, again, this is really hard to rank because, again, you have Workshop and you have Junkyard. Junkyard, in my opinion, extremely open, but to some extent it was so open that it almost created a weird feeling. It's a weird way to put it. There was always an optimal route, but it was so open, it felt really weird, like you're just doing world bosses or you're in an open world, and I don't know. I didn't really enjoy the bosses that much. Workshop, in the other hand, I actually really kind of liked. I think Workshop was a pretty good dungeon, so I don't know how to rank this. I think I'm gonna put this somewhere in maybe the C tier or something along those lines, because I liked one dungeon, which was the Workshop, and I didn't really like Junkyard that much. Again, Junkyard was really relatively easy, one of the easiest dungeons in BfA to time. Maybe I'll put it above Sanguine Deaths for the time being, but very open to interpretation. Motherload, another dungeon that a lot of people might disagree or agree. I'm not sure how they're gonna view this. A lot of people loved the dungeon and a lot of people hated the dungeon. I think I'm gonna put it somewhere in the B tier, maybe even somewhere like a low A tier, possibly A tier. I'm not quite sure actually. We're gonna put it on the A tier for the time being. A lot of people will hate this because there was so much trash, but at the same time, it had, in my opinion, a really good ratio of open space to like narrow corridors. Like, you know, the open space felt really nice. I felt the trash back was pretty good. The bosses were interesting. The first boss was really interesting with the bombs. And I like bosses that require or punish if you miss something, and it punishes you by you doing less damage. And we'll talk about this when we get to, we're nearly there, when we get to Shrine. So Temple of Satralis is another dungeon that I thought was okay. It wasn't the worst, it wasn't the best. I think I would put it somewhere in probably C tier, probably somewhere along the lines. I probably enjoyed it. High C tier in my opinion. Temple was an interesting dungeon. The last boss was really kind of cool depending on how you look at it. If you had explosives, last boss was really painful. To this similar extent that Mr. Tierna's side, the second boss would become really painful if you had explosives as well. Siege of Borealis, I think this is gonna be another F tier for me. Let's see which one I hate the most. I probably would go Siege a lot higher. I would probably do something along the lines here. Actually, no, I would do Siege as one of my most hated dungeons, because I honestly felt Siege, the fact that it was different experience for Alliance and Horde, was a cool concept that just doesn't work. It sounds great, but it just doesn't work. And I just always hated doing the dungeon. The first boss was so awkward. It ended up being a poke killer a lot of the times. Shrine of the Storm is another one, F tier for me, because if you didn't have the interrupt rotation set up, if you didn't have people who were using their interrupts, you would just suffer extremely. Actually, I'll put it as the high F tier. The only reason, because the last boss was honestly one of my favorite bosses. And this is a prime example of, you get this magic debuff and on yourself as a healer, and if you don't dispel this magic debuff, you do a ton of damage. But your effective HP is reduced extremely to an extent that any mechanic is gonna one-shot you. So you're at the mercy of people who are doing interrupts and at the mercy of yourself not standing in bad stuff. But if you do all of that, you get rewarded with an insane DPS. I thought this Kiss Curse type of kind of design, boss design, was extremely cool. But everything else in the dungeon felt like a chore, and it required an extreme coordination that in majority of the pugs felt really bad. So this is why Shrine is a high F tier for me, because of the last boss is one of my favorite bosses, but the rest of the dungeon is whatever. Underrot, honestly, I've thought about this. I think Underrot deserves an S tier spot. I don't know. What do you guys think? S tier or an A tier? I'm not 100% sure yet, but I think Underrot might be an S tier dungeon for me. I love the dungeon. I thought it was well designed. The trash mobs were interesting. There was a lot of painful trash mobs that fixate on you. It could almost one-shot you. So how you deal with those mobs was really interesting. I thought the last boss was interesting. It just gave me a warm feeling when I was doing this dungeon. I loved the aesthetic of it, and I thought it was really cool. Maybe low S tier, high A tier, in my opinion. So maybe I'm being a little bit generous of this. Now, Tol Dagor, we have to move this a little bit faster. F tier in my opinion, and I'm gonna put it high F tier. And why am I gonna put it high F tier? Because I think the dungeon had a lot of promise. A lot of people will hate this dungeon because of bugs. You pull through the walls, the nameplates look all over the place because everything's just too close to each other. But if the area was made in such a way that there would be bigger gaps between the floors and you weren't able to pull through the walls, this dungeon was actually really cool aesthetically. You kind of start off with this open area, there's a big trash bowl at the start, and then you go into a prison, and then you kind of like rescue prisoners and you get extra trash percentage. It was a really cool concept that was let down by the fact that it was the most buggiest dungeon ever made. Like the fact that you can do the last boss and then accidentally pull mobs from down below and wipe. This happened numerous times. Just made me hate this dungeon. if the books were fixed, this would actually be a pretty cool dungeon, in my honest opinion. Waycrest Manor is another dungeon that I thought, I'm gonna put it high A tier. I almost thought about putting it S tier. Again, Underrot, Waycrest Manor. I think I'm gonna put Underrot in A tier because I think the difference between two of them is not that big. Waycrest Manor is honestly, aesthetically, one of my favorite dungeons. The gimmick mechanic, I enjoyed it. I actually didn't think it was that bad. You have to go different doors, and it made you repeating this dungeon a little bit more interesting because you had a different route. Again, if you're a tank and you have to learn all those routes, it's kind of annoying. But I really like Waycrest Manor, and it's mainly because of the aesthetics. The bosses were cool, the trash pack were cool. I would do this dungeon any time of the week, and it's probably an unpopular opinion. Let me know if you like Waycrest Manor. I'm not gonna put Assault the Violent Hold in here. I'm honestly just gonna leave this. This is not a Mythic Plus dungeon, and I couldn't remove it from the list. It's not a Mythic Plus dungeon. Blackrock Hold, I'm gonna put it on somewhere in probably. Is it better than Plaguefall? It's probably on par to Plaguefall, in my opinion. Blackrock Hold is one of those dungeons that you might say that it is very close to each other. It is like there's not a lot of space when you're doing the dungeons. The hallways is not that big, but I think it's just good enough to be better than a lot of dungeons that suffered from being too close, like Tol de Gore. So again, not the best, not the worst. I still like this. There was a really interesting mechanic with mages purging debuffs from mobs and doing like an insane amount of damage. So that was a pretty cool mechanic in MDI. Cathedral is one of those dungeons. Again, we're probably going to be putting a lot of dungeons. Do I put it in D tier? I don't think it deserves a D tier. I think it deserves a low C tier. And the reason why people hate Cathedral is because it was overly difficult at the start. Same you'll see with the Seed of Triumvirate. It was overtuned, and it put a sour taste in people's mouths. They were just like, I just don't want to do it. And they nerfed it. I don't think Cathedral was a bad dungeon. I think it had interesting bosses and interesting trash mechanics. So around C tier. Court of Stars, I honestly really like Court of Stars, but I just don't know where to put it. Do I put it in B tier or do I put it in C? I think I'm going to put it in B tier at this moment, but it could easily go into A tier. Easily go into A tier in my opinion. But Court of Stars, again, it was a gimmicky mechanic with the buffs that you could get. It was interesting. It was a short dungeon. A lot of people enjoy this kind of, they don't want to have 40, at least in my opinion, I don't want to have a 40-minute dungeon. So I enjoyed a relatively short dungeon that had RNG to it. It wasn't really great for MDI, where they had to have fixed buffs and things like that. But B or A tier, let me know. Should Court of Stars be higher? Maw of Souls. Is this an S tier, Maw of Souls? Should I put Maw of Souls in S tier because A, it is one of the quickest dungeons ever done. If you have a really good group, if you're doing like a 15, whatever. B, it's very easy. Or relatively easy depending on how you look at it. It is infamous for being spammed by all the people to get the power on your characters and things like that. So do I put it as an S tier or high A tier? I think I'm gonna put it S tier because even though you're, let's say, forced to spam this dungeon a lot of the times, you would still do it and you probably still have a decent time. Let me know, guys. Is Maw of Souls being S tier or A tier too high? We might change this. Halls of Valor. Now, a lot of people hate Halls of Valor. I actually really enjoyed Halls of Valor to some extent. I was playing Boomkin at the time. I thought the open space was a perfect ratio there. I thought there were certain bosses that had a lot of RNG to them. The one, if you go to the left side and you go to the end, the boss had a chance of one-shotting you with you not being able to do anything about it if you got a bad combination of abilities, which meant that it was really, really awkward. But I actually liked Halls. I have a Shara is another dungeon that I thought was pretty cool. I could do it a lot of the times. I think I'm gonna put it in B tier. I think I enjoyed Eye of Shara more than any of the dungeons here. Again, this is an extremely open space dungeon. I think it was one of the best open space dungeons. Eye of Shara is probably going to be remembered for the infamous skip that you can do where you have to climb up on the shipwreck and you can skip a lot of trash back with it, and a lot of people might fail this. And I thought that was a really interesting gimmick that, kind of made your day if you failed it or if you did really well. So Eye of Shara, definitely a decent dungeon. Dark Heart Ticket is going to be another dungeon that I'm going to put S tier. I honestly feel Dark Heart Ticket, Honestly, I could put it as one of my favorite dungeons. I think I'm gonna put it as on par to Freehold. Darkheart was probably the most complete dungeon that I've ever seen. I thought the whole aesthetics of it was really cool. The fact that this dungeon was relatively fast, it was relatively easy, but the bosses still had enough mechanics to make you interesting, or make it interesting. I don't know how to describe it, but honestly, Darkheart is one of those dungeons that I would do over and over and over in Legion, and I would always have a great time. And honestly, it is an S tier for me. Neltharion Slayer is another dungeon that I really like. Now, I don't know if I put Neltharion Slayer on the S tier or high A tier. I'm probably gonna put it in high A tier at this point, mainly because I thought it was a really cool dungeon. The trash, infamous trash, with the rubble coming down on you required a nice weak aura, a nice self-awareness, because he could definitely one-shot you quite easily. He could destroy the run if you stack and you don't, bait it properly. So I think there's a lot of things about Neltharion Slayer that made the dungeon interesting, and I would do it quite a lot. Maybe not good enough for S tier at this point. Return to Karazhan is going to be very weird because he has two dungeons. He has the Lower Kara and Upper Kara. I kind of liked Lower Karazhan was a decent dungeon. Upper Kara I really disliked. I really disliked Upper Kara because of the last boss. Last boss with the beam, with the platforms, you get knocked off and things like that. It created probably one of the most worst experiences in Pugs for me. So I would probably put Karazhan, honestly, maybe in D tier, and that's mainly because of Upper Karazhan. Lower Karazhan was more than good enough to be a B or C tier, but I'm mainly putting it because I kind of separate the dungeons at this point. Maybe that's a bit too low, but I just didn't like Upper. Seed of Triumvirate is one of those dungeons that people really didn't enjoy as well because it was over difficult. I think it became a lot better after a certain time, but I'm probably gonna put it in D tier for the time being because I just didn't run this dungeon as much as I like to, and I didn't really get to I didn't get to form an opinion whether it was good or bad. So at this point, I'm going to put it somewhere in D tier. Vault of Wardens, I'm going to put in the B tier. I think Vault of Wardens have an insane amount of bosses, which made Tyrannical Weeks really awkward if you had a group that wasn't that great, because it's basically all bosses and very little trash. The fact that you have some of the most mechanically difficult bosses in this dungeon. The last boss, if a person who has the light doesn't do it properly, it's a wipe. There are bosses, if you get hit by like these beams, those beams get split into like more beams or these like orbs, and then it becomes harder. Most of the bosses in this dungeon, if one person fails, it's going to be a wipe because it's so mechanically difficult, and I really like that, but it also became a pain after a certain time. So I think I put Ivashar and Walt on the similar path here, and Arquay is another dungeon that is probably gonna split opinions. A lot of people might hate this, a lot of people might like this because it was a relatively long dungeon, and it had a lot of bosses, and there were a lot of gimmicky mechanics where at a certain point you could skip like platforms if you jumped up on these. I don't know how many people know about this. I think I would put this on a high C tier, low B tier to some extent. And again, this video was extremely long. I think I could change a couple of things. And I could move a couple of dungeons up and down, but I think I'm happy with this tier list for the time being. Let me know how you feel about this. If you'll notice that the Shadowlands dungeons in here, so you have Necrotic Wake and Halls, these are my two favorite dungeons at this given point, then everything else being relatively low. I think I enjoyed Legion dungeons a lot. You can see a lot of the Darkheart Ticket, more Souls. I think I enjoyed BfA dungeons a lot. I think Freehold and Latal Desire were really, really, really cool. So this is my ranking, and I do hope that the next expansion dungeons are going to be more catered towards, or they take their design philosophies from Legion or BfA. I think a lot of Shadowlands dungeons could be improved in a lot of ways. But let me know what would be your S tier dungeons. Let me know in the comments. I'll read all of them. Thank you guys, and I'll see you in my next video.